They were children, high school students, college freshmen, facing fire hoses, fists, and fear for daring to walk peacefully toward justice. And then came a bloody Sunday, a bridge in Selma, state troopers waving batons raised. John Lewis led the march and was nearly killed for it. March. Book 2 isn't just a graphic novel, it's a memory, scorched into America's soul, and into the skull of a 25-year-old with a fractured head and unbreakable spirit. This story will shake you. And it should, because it's not over. Let's turn to the first page. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Book Podcast Zone. I'm Emma.
And I'm John. Today we're embarking on really a deeply impactful journey through March, Book 2. It's a graphic novel memoir by Congressman John Lewis and Andrew Aydin, with these incredibly powerful illustrations by Nate Powell. And, you know, that this isn't just a book. It's really like a living window into the raw, intense, and, well, often brutal realities of the civil rights movement. We see it directly through the eyes of one of its most courageous leaders, a really enduring leader. So we'll be distilling the most important insights, the key nuggets from this powerful narrative, really offer you a shortcut to understanding the events that shaped the nation and, honestly, continue to resonate with such force today.
Yeah, absolutely. And our mission for you today really is to walk you through John Lewis's firsthand experiences. We'll start with the strategic brilliance and that quiet courage of the Nashville Sit-Ins. Then we'll move into the terrifying, visceral violence of the freedom rides. And finally, we'll get to the monumental but also really complex March on Washington. We'll unpack the unwavering commitment, the hard-won compromises that had to be made, and the profound human cost of fighting for justice. We want to ensure you walk away not just informed, but deeply moved and truly engaged by this vital piece of American history. So let's really unpack this together.
Okay, so our journey begins in Chapter 1, and it really thrusts us right into the heart of the Nashville Sit-In campaign. What immediately becomes clear, I think, from those opening pages in the graphic novel is the extraordinary discipline and the moral conviction of these young activists, right? Including a very young John Lewis. They weren't just protesting haphazardly. They were like meticulously executing a strategy of nonviolent direct action.
Can you maybe elaborate a bit on what these specific acts of defiance actually looked like and, the immense bravery they must have required?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here, and it's something Lewis and Aydin with Powell's art illuminated so vividly, is the sheer depth of the planning behind the sit-ins.
Wow.
This wasn't just a spontaneous surge of anger, It was a calculated, almost radical choice at the time. The book shows how these young people, many of them college students like Lewis from Fisk University or American Baptist Theological Seminary, they deliberately put themselves in harm's way. They'd walk into a place like Woolworth's or Crest department store, find the segregated lunch counter, and just sit down.
Such a simple act, but...
Exactly. A simple act that was, in that context, an explosive challenge to the whole social order. And Lewis's narrative really highlights the rigorous, almost military-level training they underwent. Places like the Highlander Folk School, local workshops led by figures like James Lawson.
James Lawson, he's such a key figure, isn't he? What did that training actually involve? Because the idea of preparing to face that kind of hostility, that hatred, without reacting, it's almost beyond comprehension for many of us today.
It absolutely is. And their training wasn't just theoretical, sitting around talking about it. It was intensely practical. Lawson, he'd studied Gandhi's principles of nonviolence, satyagraha in India. He put them through these grueling role-playing scenarios.
Role-playing, like acting it out.
Yeah. They practiced enduring verbal abuse. People playing the role of antagonists would spit on them, well, pretend to spit, or maybe use water.
Yeah.
They'd call them every racial slur imaginable, simulate shoving them, even hitting them lightly. They learned specific physical postures, how to curl into a fetal position to protect vital organs if they were dragged off the stools, how to cover their heads and necks, how to go limp, fall passively if pulled.
Wow. It sounds incredibly intense.
It was. The objective was to appear calm, almost serene even, in the face of this escalating aggression. Lewis actually recounts moments where they were taught breathing exercises to slow their heart rates, to project this unshakable inner peace. So it was a psychological and a physical discipline really designed to break the cycle of violence. By refusing to retaliate, they exposed the aggressor's brutality in stark contrast to their own peaceful resolve.
So it wasn't weakness, it was a strategy.
Exactly. This radical choice of nonviolence, far from being perceived as weakness by them, was their ultimate strength. It was strategically calculated to disarm their opponents morally and force a confrontation not of physical might, but of, conscience.
So their non-reaction wasn't just about personal bravery, which was immense, but it was a profound strategic tool for the movement. It really does sound like a masterclass in civil disobedience. And Nashville in 1960, graphic novel makes it really clear. It was a genuine hotbed of racial tension. What did that environment actually mean for a Black citizen's daily life back then?
Well, imagine a city where almost every public space was a minefield of segregation rules. This hotbed of racial tension meant that for Black citizens, just getting through the day was a constant negotiation with Jim Crow laws. We're talking about segregated facilities, not just at lunch counters, right?
Right.
Separate restrooms, often in terrible condition, different entrances for buses, designated seating areas way in the back, separate schools, parks, water fountains, even cemeteries.
Just everywhere.
Everywhere. In many department stores, you couldn't try on clothes if you were Black. You certainly couldn't eat in the same restaurants as whites, maybe get takeout from a back window if you were lucky. So these sit-ins were never just about getting a sandwich, were they? They were about reclaiming fundamental human dignity. They were challenging a system designed really to deny their very humanity at every turn. And the beauty of Lewis's account, especially with Powell's art, is how it brings that lived reality into sharp focus. It makes the decision to sit in not just some abstract protest, but a deeply personal, deeply felt act of reclamation.
Yeah, that context is so important. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or SNCC, as you said it, was pronounced that emerged as a really vital player here, didn't it?
Yeah.
How did SNCC's approach maybe differ from or complement other civil rights organizations that were active at this early stage?
Right. SNCC was pretty unique in its structure and focus, especially early on. It was very much youth-led, very grassroots. It grew directly out of these sit-ins. Unlike, say, the NAACP, which had a long, venerable history, focused primarily on legal challenges through the court's landmark cases like Brown v. Board of Education, or the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which tended towards large-scale campaigns often built around charismatic leadership and mobilizing churches. SNCC emphasized direct action. It was about empowering local communities and young activists to take charge themselves. Lewis, as one of its founding members and later its chairman, really embodies this spirit.
So more bottom-up in a way.
Exactly. Their strategy was about forcing these moral confrontations right there on the streets, in the lunch counters, in the bus stations, bringing the injustice directly into public view, making it impossible to ignore. And this meticulous strategic effort in Nashville, it created a model. It showed that disciplined, nonviolent direct action could be profoundly effective. They actually achieved desegregation in downtown Nashville lunch counters only months after the sit-ins began.
That quickly, wow.
Relatively quickly, yes, considering the resistance. And this wasn't just an isolated victory. It became a blueprint. It inspired others.
And that blueprint, as you say, led to this kind of domino effect across the South. These seemingly small acts of defiance really did spark a much broader movement, didn't they? Lewis depicts how news of Nashville's success and just the raw courage of its students inspired similar protests elsewhere.
Absolutely. And the graphic novel format, with its vivid narration, as the source puts it, truly immerses you. It allows you to kind of feel the protesters' resolve in ways that maybe a traditional history text might not capture as effectively. You see these panels, these drawings by Nate Powell, depicting the stoicism on their faces, their determined posture, even as they're being, doused with coffee or ketchup or kicked and dragged away.
It makes it so immediate.
It does. It's not just a recounting of facts. It's an immersion into the emotional and psychological toll, and also the immense strength required to endure it. And this detailed depiction, from the training sessions we talked about to actually enduring the abuse, it just underscores the strategic foresight involved. It wasn't recklessness. It was this calculated moral decision to meet aggression with peace. This strategic brilliance allowed them to, in a way, control their side of the confrontation. It ensured that the violence was always directed at them, never from them. And that contrast, it was powerful. It transformed public perception slowly but surely and forced America, or at least parts of it, to look itself in the mirror and confront the reality that segregation was an injustice maintained by sheer brutality.
It truly showed the power of moral conviction turning into direct, disciplined action. A profound lesson Lewis conveys just through his own lived experience. Okay, thinking about the impact of this chapter, it really sets the stage, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It establishes the core principles, the tactics, and introduces us to the key players, including Lewis himself, at the very beginning of his incredible journey.
If you're finding this deep dive valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you'd like, subscribe, and share. It helps us reach more people interested in these important stories. Okay, so here's where it gets, I think, really intense. Chapter 2 takes us directly into the heart of the freedom rides. This feels like a new and definitely escalating front in the battle for equality. We move from the kind of stationary defiance of the sit-ins to this kinetic, moving challenge of the freedom rides. What exactly were John Lewis and the other freedom riders trying to achieve by boarding those buses? And what kind of bravery did this new form of protest demand? It feels different.
Yeah, it was different. And this chapter, it raises an important question, I think. How did the storytelling of Lewis and Aydin really shine as they wove these deeply personal anecdotes, Lewis's own experiences, with the broader struggle? The writer's mission was, well, incredibly audacious for 1961. They boarded interstate buses, Greyhound, trailways to directly challenge segregated travel facilities. Specifically, they were testing the Supreme Court's ruling in Boynton v. Virginia. That ruling from just the year before, 1960, explicitly outlawed segregation in facilities serving interstate passengers. So bus terminals, waiting rooms, restrooms, restaurants connected to them.
So the law was technically on their side.
Technically, yes. Federal law. But the problem was many southern states were just flat out ignoring it, acting like the ruling didn't exist. So the Freedom Riders were effectively forcing the issue. They were integrating these spaces with their presence, daring the states, daring local authorities to defy federal law right out in the open, in front of the entire nation and the world, really.
And the bravery required, it seems dialed up even further, right? They're moving targets, going deeper into hostile territory.
Oh, immensely so. We're talking about an almost unfathomable level of courage, because they knew they would face an inevitable, brutal backlash. It wasn't a question of if, but when and how bad. In the book, the graphic novel, it really does make you feel like you're on the bus with them. Powell's art, Lewis's narration, it amplifies the danger, the claustrophobia sometimes, but also their unwavering determination. You see panels depicting fists flying towards them, faces just contorted in rage outside the bus windows. But the riders, they maintain their composure, their nonviolent stance. It's a testament to that training, that commitment, even when staring down literal mob violence.
And the graphic novel doesn't shy away from depicting specific, truly harrowing acts of violence. It really brings to life the dangers they faced, the reality of it. Can you maybe paint a picture of some of those critical moments described in this chapter?
It definitely doesn't shy away. The book highlights several horrifying events that expose the raw brutality of the opposition. You see panels illustrating riders being pulled from buses, beaten viciously with things like chains, lead pipes, baseball bats, arrested en masse simply for trying to use a whites-only waiting room or restroom, which was supposedly illegal to deny them. But maybe the most shocking example depicted from this early phase, the one that really caught national attention, is the mob violence in Anniston, Alabama. This was on Mother's Day, May 14th, 1961.
Mother's Day. Wow.
Yeah. Lewis's narrative, combined with Powell's stark illustrations, shows the Greyhound bus carrying the first group of Freedom Riders being surrounded and attacked by a white mob right outside Anniston. The tires were slashed. The bus was forced to stop on the side of the road. And then someone threw a firebomb through a window. The bus just erupted in flames. The riders were trapped inside, choking on smoke. They had to escape through a broken window at the rear, only to be met by the waiting, furious mob outside, ready to beat them. It's just a moment of sheer terror and chaos, rendered with horrifying clarity in the book.
Just imagining that and maintaining nonviolence in the face of that, it's almost incomprehensible.
It truly underscores the monumental bravery required. Not just bravery in theory, but in the most terrifying, life-threatening moments imaginable.
And these weren't just isolated incidents, right? The historical context of the 1961 Freedom Rides makes it clear this was a coordinated campaign, pushing a specific legal point. How did the organizations involved, like CORE and SNCC, collaborate? Or did they sometimes differ in their approaches during these rides?
That's a really important point. These weren't isolated flare-ups. It was a planned campaign, initially organized by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. CORE was a smaller interracial organization, but deeply committed to nonviolent direct action, inspired by Gandhian principles even earlier than SNCC in some ways. They planned the original Freedom Ride 61 route. However, as the violence escalated so dramatically, particularly after Anniston and then the brutal attacks in Birmingham that followed, some CORE leaders felt they couldn't continue without more substantial federal protection, which wasn't really forthcoming at first. They considered pausing the rides.
Understandable, given the circumstances.
Absolutely. But this is where SNCC, with John Lewis right there at the forefront, having just come from the Nashville movement, stepped in decisively. Lewis, along with Diane Nash and other Nashville students, felt it was absolutely critical to continue the riots. Their belief was if they stopped now, if they let violence shut them down, it would send a terrible message. It would signal to the segregationists that violence worked, that it could stop the movement.
So SNCC picked up the baton, essentially.
They did. They organized reinforcements, more students willing to ride. This dynamic shows, yes, a deep level of collaboration and shared purpose, but also reveals perhaps a difference in risk tolerance or strategic emphasis at that moment. SNCC, being younger, perhaps more radicalized by the sit-ins, was often willing to embrace a higher level of risk, a deeper level of sacrifice. They truly believed that suffering injustice nonviolently and visibly could force change. Their unflinching commitment to keep the rides going, even when faced with such dire consequences, created this powerful synergy that ultimately forced the federal government's hand.
And that dedication, combined with the fierce resistance they encountered, created this absolute firestorm of national and even international attention, didn't it? The graphic depictions of the resistance from white supremacists and the shocking indifference or sometimes complicity of local law enforcement that was documented and broadcast across the country. Can you give us some of those local U.S.-based examples? Specific places that became notorious battlegrounds during the riots?
Oh, definitely. The routes of these buses cut deep into the heart of the Deep South, creating these real-time confrontations in specific towns and states with very real, very violent consequences. After the horror of the Anniston firebombing, the riders faced another horrifying assault just hours later in Birmingham, Alabama. The police commissioner there was Eugene Bull Connor.
Bull Connor, a name synonymous with brutal resistance.
Exactly, a staunch segregationist. And reports later confirmed he had indeed made a deal with the local Ku Klux Klan. He promised them 15 minutes to attack the arriving Freedom Riders bus at the Trailway station without any police intervention.
15 minutes.
Unbelievable. And they did. Riders, including some who had been on the bus in Anniston and managed to get to Birmingham, were brutally beaten with bats, chains, pikes right there on the platform as they stepped off the bus. The graphic novel depicts this chaos, this utter brutality. Activists curled up, trying to protect themselves, while fists and weapons just rained down. James Peck, a white activist, needed dozens of stitches. The photos from Birmingham, splashed across national newspapers, were shocking. It was undeniable.
And Montgomery, too, right? That was another flashpoint.
Yes. Just a few days later, May 20th, when a new group of Freedom Riders, including John Lewis and some of the Nashville contingent who had decided to continue the rides, arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, the state capital.
Yeah.
They arrived with the expectation of some police protection this time, maybe even federal marshals. But when they got off the bus, the police just vanished. And a massive violent mob materialized, seemingly out of nowhere, but likely well organized. Again, they attacked the riders, reporters, even some federal agents who were there observing. John Lewis himself was severely beaten in Montgomery. He describes being hit from behind with a wooden crate collapsing, thinking he might die right there on the pavement at the Greyhound station. John Seigenthaler, an aide to Attorney General Robert Kennedy who was there trying to mediate, was knocked unconscious trying to help some riders escape.
It's just staggering.
These moments in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery, they weren't just random acts of thuggery. They were direct, public challenges to federal authority, played out on the streets, broadcast to the world. They starkly exposed the South's defiance of federal law and forced the federal government, the Kennedy administration, into an unavoidable crisis.
The book truly depicts the human cost of activism in such a visceral way, doesn't it? You can almost feel the fear, the pain, but you also see those resolute expressions on the writers' faces, the sheer solidarity among them.
It really does. The graphic novel format amplifies this profoundly. Through Powell's art, you get these close-ups of faces, sometimes contorted in pain, sometimes defiant in their stoicism. You see the depiction of injuries, the blood, the chaos of the mobs. It's not just reading about it, it feels like an immersive experience. And the storytelling, weaving in Lewis's personal anecdotes, really shines here. For instance, Lewis recounts seeing a young white girl among the attackers in Montgomery, screaming epithets and the profound sadness that realization brought him, seeing hatred in someone so young. It humanizes the struggle in a way that statistics or dry accounts just can't. It's not just about the activists. It's about the moral landscape of America at that time.
Yeah, it adds that layer of deep human feeling.
And this act of exposing the South's defiance of federal law was monumental. The blatant lack of enforcement of the Boynton ruling highlighted a fundamental breakdown of the rule of law in many southern states. The implications were clear. The federal government, particularly the Kennedy administration, which had been trying to tread carefully, would either have to step up and enforce its own laws or completely lose credibility, both domestically and internationally, especially during the Cold War.
Right. The hypocrisy would be glaring.
Exactly. This direct challenge to federal authority ultimately demanded a forceful response, simply because the nation and the world was watching.
And the resilience they showed in the face of that mob violence, it's almost superhuman when you think about it.
It really is. These writers possess not just incredible physical courage, but also this profound psychological and emotional strength. They believe so deeply in their cause, in the righteousness of equality, and in the power of nonviolence as a tactic and a philosophy, that they could endure unimaginable pain and fear without breaking their commitment. It was a testament to their deep spiritual and moral convictions, rooted in faith for many, like Lewis. It showed the world that their cause was just, and their spirit was ultimately unbreakable. That was the message they sent, louder than any violence directed against them.
It truly was. The book doesn't let you forget that raw, visceral experience. It really makes you understand what John Lewis meant by good trouble, necessary trouble. Okay. If you're finding this journey through March, book 2 compelling, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue these deep dives. So what does this all mean as the freedom rides intensified and ventured even deeper into the Deep South? Chapter 3 shows us an escalation of violence that, honestly, makes even the earlier events in Anniston and Birmingham, though incredibly harrowing, seem almost like a prelude. We're talking about unrelenting attacks leading to arson, mob violence, and a level of state-sponsored resistance that became undeniable flashpoints for the nation and forced a real crisis.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Lewis and Aydin's analysis of the movement's growing pains, as the source material puts it, is really insightful here in Chapter 3. The narrative picks up steam after SNCC committed to continuing the freedom rides. Refusing to let the violence in Alabama stop them, they pushed further south into Mississippi. And Mississippi was in many ways considered even more dangerous, more resistant than Alabama.
And the authorities there took a different approach, didn't they? Less overt mob violence initially, but more state repression.
Exactly. Instead of the chaotic mob scenes of Alabama in Jackson, Mississippi, the strategy shifted. When Lewis and the next wave of freedom riders arrived at the bus terminal and attempted to use the whites-only facility's restrooms, waiting rooms, they were immediately arrested by Jackson police. Their charge, breach of peace, basically arrested for peacefully defying segregation ordinances, which again were technically illegal under federal law regarding interstate travel.
So fill the jails. That was the strategy.
Fill the jails. Over 300 freedom riders were arrested in Jackson alone during the summer of 1961. Lewis describes the conditions they faced. They were sent to the notorious Mississippi State Penitentiary, also known as Parchman Farm.
Parchman Farm, that has a dark reputation.
A very dark reputation. It was essentially a brutal prison plantation. Lewis recounts the degrading treatment, the terrible food, the attempts by guards to break their spirits. They had their mattresses taken away, slept on steel bunks. They were subjected to constant harassment. But even there, Lewis writes, they maintained their unity and nonviolent discipline. They sang freedom songs. They organized themselves. They continued their protest even behind bars. Their refusal to pay fines or bail, choosing jail time instead jail no bail, became another powerful tactic, putting economic and logistical pressure on the state.
So even imprisonment became a form of resistance. But despite this harrowing state repression in Mississippi, the book emphasizes the writer's unwavering unity. It's truly remarkable how they maintained that common front under such duress.
It is remarkable. The shared experience, the shared commitment, forged incredible bonds. They drew strength from each other, from their songs, from their shared belief in the cause.
But the book also delves into the internal conflicts, right? The disagreements within the broader civil rights movement over strategy and leadership that were simmering beneath the surface. What were those tensions, especially as the stakes got higher?
That's right. While the image projected to the public was often one of monolithic unity, and the core goal was shared, Lewis and Aydin bravely explore these growing pains and internal debates. It makes the story more real, more complex. As we touched on, SNCC, heavily influenced by its young, often more radical and very direct action-oriented members like Lewis, sometimes found itself at odds with older, more established organizations. The NAACP, for example, continued to prioritize legal battles and lobbying. Some within the NAACP were skeptical of the confrontational tactics of the freedom rides and sit-ins, fearing they might provoke backlash or alienate potential allies. Even within the SCLC, led by Dr. King, there were sometimes strategic differences. King, while deeply committed to nonviolence, also had to navigate complex political pressures and sometimes favored consolidating gains or choosing battles carefully, which occasionally frustrated the more impatient SNCC activists who wanted to push harder, faster.
So generational differences too, perhaps.
Partly generational, partly strategic, partly philosophical about the best way to achieve change. For instance, during the Freedom Rides, after the initial violence, there were intense discussions among leaders from CORE, SCLC, SNCC, and others about whether to continue. Some argued it was becoming too dangerous, risking lives for diminishing returns in media attention. But SNCC members, particularly Lewis, Diane Nash, and others from the Nashville group, passionately insisted that stopping would be a catastrophic mistake. It would validate violence as a tool to stop the movement.
They felt they had to keep going no matter the cost.
Pretty much. These internal discussions, which Lewis recounts frankly, highlight the complexity. It wasn't a single hive mind. It was a dynamic, sometimes contentious collection of individuals and organizations, all striving for the same ultimate goal of equality, but with genuinely different ideas on the best path to get there. Lewis's personal narrative allows you to feel the weight of these decisions, the arguments, the compromises, and the personal toll they took on everyone involved.
And Alabama, as we discussed, became a particular flashpoint because of its deeply entrenched segregationist policies and aggressive state leadership. Governor George Wallace famously declaring, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." These violent events, the firebombing, the beatings in Birmingham and Montgomery witnessed by the nation, effectively forced the Kennedy administration to intervene more directly, didn't they?
They absolutely did. And this reveals a crucial insight, really, about the federal government's initial, let's say, reluctance to fully support civil rights with direct federal power. Prior to the Freedom Rides, President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had been cautious. They preferred pushing civil rights through the courts, appointing some black officials using moral suasion, but they wanted to avoid direct federal intervention in the South if possible. They were trying to maintain political stability, keep Southern Democrats in their coalition.
A political calculation.
Largely, yes. But when those images, the burning bus in Anniston, the bloodied faces of activists like John Lewis and James Werg in Montgomery flooded the national airways and newspapers, it became an undeniable crisis. It wasn't just a domestic issue. It seriously damaged America's image on the world stage during the height of the Cold War, fighting for hearts and minds against the Soviet Union. How could America claim to be the leader of the free world when this was happening within its own borders?
The hypocrisy was unavoidable.
Exactly. The violence directly challenged federal authority. It showed that state and local governments in the South were either unwilling or unable to uphold federal law and protect citizens' constitutional rights. This forced the Kennedys' hand. Robert Kennedy started dispatching federal marshals to try and protect the rioters, often arriving too late or being too few, but it was a start. More importantly, he began putting intense pressure on the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC.
The ICC, what was their role?
The ICC was the federal agency responsible for regulating interstate travel. Despite the Boynton ruling, they hadn't issued clear regulations to enforce it. Under pressure from the Attorney General, spurred by the relentless Freedom Rides, the ICC finally issued strict rules in September 1961, explicitly banning segregation in interstate bus terminals, effective November 1st. Signs indicating white and colored waiting rooms, restrooms, and lunch counters in terminals serving interstate passengers had to come down.
So the Freedom Rides directly led to that concrete federal action.
Directly. It was a major victory, a direct result of the Freedom Riders' persistence, their willingness to endure violence, and the undeniable visual evidence of the South's lawlessness that they generated. It showed that the federal government often only intervened decisively when the situation became so overtly violent and chaotic, so publicly embarrassing that it could no longer be ignored. They were essentially dragged into action by the sheer moral force and the strategic brilliance of the movement.
And the graphic novel's visuals, alongside Lewis's intense narration, they really do convey the chaos of the Deep South, don't they? You see the sheer scale of the mob sometimes, the raw brutality in Powell's drawings, the faces, both the attackers filled with hate, and the stoic, determined activists. It makes you feel like you're right there experiencing that palpable threat.
It absolutely does. Powell's artwork is crucial. He uses panel layouts, shading, close-ups, and dynamic action sequences to create a sense of immediacy and danger that words alone might struggle to convey. You feel the claustrophobia on the bus, the explosion of violence, the grim determination. It makes you feel the palpable threat in a way that's quite profound.
And these violent encounters did shape public opinion dramatically, didn't they? How did seeing this unfold impact people outside the South, or even people within the South who might have been on the fence?
Dramatically is the right word. Before the Freedom Rides, many white Americans, especially outside the South, could perhaps rationalize segregation, see it as a distant Southern problem, or simply remain indifferent. Many might have believed the sanitized version of separate, but equal. But seeing the raw brutality unleashed against peaceful, well-dressed, disciplined demonstrators, young people, clergy, both black and white, made it impossible to look away or pretend it wasn't happening. News reports, photographs, and eventually televised footage created this powerful visual narrative that cut through the political rhetoric and forced a moral reckoning across the country, and indeed around the world. It shattered the illusion of a peaceful, orderly South governed by law and exposed the systemic violence used to maintain segregation. People who might have been sympathetic but passive were often moved to support the movement more actively.
And the writer's persistence, despite this horrific violence, you really get the sense from the book that this was a critical turning point for the movement. Why was their refusal to give up so important?
It was absolutely critical. Their refusal to be intimidated, their willingness to continue the rides even after the Anniston firebombing, the Birmingham beatings, the Montgomery assault, the mass arrests in Mississippi. It demonstrated an unshakable resolve that had several key effects. First, it inspired countless others. If these young people could face this danger, others felt they could too. It fueled recruitment and broadened participation in the movement. Second, it created immense sustained pressure on both state governments in the South and, crucially, the federal government in Washington. They simply couldn't make the problem go away by ignoring it or using violence. The riders kept coming. Third, it solidified the moral authority of the movement. It showed the world that the fight for civil rights was not just a political dispute, but a profound moral crusade, and that these activists possessed a deep spiritual strength that violence could not extinguish. This unwavering commitment in the face of such clear danger really solidified their momentum. It proved that nonviolent moral witness could, in fact, force political change, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. It was a powerful validation of their strategy.
They absolutely refused to let the violence win. A truly profound lesson in perseverance, strategy, and courage. Okay, we've covered some incredibly intense ground. If you're just joining us or finding this deep dive meaningful, a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share really helps the channel. All right, let's unpack this truly monumental moment in American history. Chapter 4 of March. Book 2 culminates in the historic 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Now, this wasn't just another protest, was it? It was conceived, as the book shows, as a massive unifying moment for the entire, sometimes fragmented, civil rights movement, bringing together diverse groups under a single, powerful banner. What was its stated purpose, and why was it seen as so significant at that particular time?
Right. And what's truly fascinating here, and is something Lewis and Aydin's vivid recounting, paired with Powell's epic scale illustrations, really makes a highlight of the book, is the sheer scale and the dual purpose of the march. Its stated purpose, right there in the name, was for jobs and freedom. This is crucial. It wasn't solely about civil rights legislation, although that was a huge part of it, demanding passage of the civil rights bill that President Kennedy had proposed. It was also explicitly demanding economic equality, addressing the crushing poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunity faced by black communities, North and South.
So connecting civil rights and economic justice right from the start.
Absolutely. The organizers, led by veterans like A. Philip Randolph, who had proposed a march back in the 1940s, and the brilliant strategist Bayard Rustin, understood that legal rights without economic opportunity were incomplete. And John Lewis, as the newly elected chairman of SNCC, had a profoundly significant role. He was the youngest speaker on the main program, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the youth wing, the shock troops of the movement who had been on the front lines of the sit-ins and freedom rides.
His presence itself must have been a powerful statement.
A very powerful statement. Here's this young man, barely 23 years old, who had already been arrested something like 40 times, brutally beaten in Rock Hill, Montgomery, nearly died. Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial alongside giants like Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young of the Urban League, he represented the voice of the youth, the impatience, the demand for immediate change. Freedom now was SNCC's slogan.
But his speech, his original speech, became a major point of controversy behind the scenes, didn't it? The book details how it was censored, and it's a really revealing moment about the internal dynamics of the coalition that organized the march. He initially intended to deliver a much more scathing critique, particularly of the federal government. What were some of the militancy points, as they were called, that led to it being toned down?
Yes, this is a crucial and often overlooked part of the march's story, which Lewis recounts with understandable frustration, even decades later. His initial draft, written with input from other SNCC members, was far more confrontational, far more critical than what some of the older, more moderate civil rights leaders, and especially the Kennedy administration liaisons, were comfortable with. He intended to directly challenge the federal government's inaction and complicity. Lines like, "We cannot depend on the federal government. The party of Kennedy is the party of Eastland," referring to James Eastland, a powerful segregationist senator from Mississippi. He planned to ask, which side is the federal government on?
Pretty direct criticism.
Very direct. He also planned to call the proposed civil rights bill, which the march was ostensibly supporting, too little and too late. He argued it didn't protect black people trying to vote, didn't protect activists from police brutality, didn't do enough for economic justice. And perhaps the most fiery line, the one that caused the biggest uproar when circulated beforehand, was, "We will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie the way Sherman did. We shall pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground nonviolently."
Wow. Invoking Sherman's March.
That's incredibly provocative language.
Hugely provocative. The reference to General Sherman's devastating march through the Confederacy during the Civil War was seen as inflammatory, hinting at destruction, even though he added nonviolently. Archbishop Patrick O'Boyle of Washington, D.C., who was scheduled to give the invocation, threatened to withdraw if Lewis delivered the speech as written. Other moderate leaders worried it would alienate President Kennedy and members of Congress whose votes they needed for the Civil Rights Bill.
So intense pressure to change it. Intense pressure. Lewis describes being taken aside, essentially into a small room behind Lincoln's statue, just before the speeches began. Figures like Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, whom Lewis deeply respected, and even Martin Luther King Jr. appealed to him to modify the text for the sake of unity. King reportedly said something like, "John, I know how you feel, but we've come this far together. Let's stay together." It was an incredibly difficult moment for Lewis, feeling he was being asked to compromise SNCC's radical voice. But ultimately, out of respect for Randolph and the plea for unity, he agreed to make changes, literally rewriting parts of it moments before he went on stage.
That must have been agonizing.
You can feel the agony in his retelling. But the compromise, while personally painful for Lewis, was seen by the organizers as necessary to maintain that unified front for this massive, unprecedented event. They wanted the march's public message to be one of broad consensus, focusing on shared demands, not internal divisions, maximizing its impact on the government and the nation. It really reveals the strategic balancing act required for these large-scale coalition movements.
And that censorship, that tension, highlights a crucial historical context: the sheer, overwhelming scale of the march itself. The book mentions over 250,000 people gathering on the National Mall, 250,000 people demanding civil rights and economic equality. It's almost unimaginable to organize something like that, especially in 1963.
It was an unprecedented logistical feat. The chief organizer, Bayard Rustin, was a master strategist, but he had to work miracles. Coordinating thousands of buses and trains coming from all over the country, imagine the scheduling. Ensuring water stations, first aid tents, sanitation facilities for 250,000 people on a hot August day. And crucially, maintaining strict nonviolent discipline among such a massive, diverse crowd, especially given the tensions of the time and the potential for provocation.
And the atmosphere that day. What was it like? Lewis describes it in the book.
He describes it as electric, almost unbelievable. The atmosphere on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963 was truly historic, deeply emotional, and overwhelmingly peaceful. Lewis talks about the incredible diversity of the crowd. It wasn't just black Americans, although they were the majority. There were significant numbers of white allies, clergy from various faiths, labor union members carrying banners, students, old people, young people, all united in this common cause. Powell's illustrations capture this sea of faces stretching from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial all the way back to the Washington Monument. It was this monumental, real, live expression of American democratic protest, a powerful visual statement in itself.
And as you mentioned, the censorship of Lewis's speech really did vividly reflect the underlying tensions between radical and moderate factions within the movement, didn't it? Who represented these different viewpoints, broadly speaking?
Broadly speaking, you have figures like Lewis and many others in SNCC representing the more radical, impatient wing. They had been on the front lines facing the violence directly and felt an urgent need for fundamental revolutionary change now. They were skeptical of gradualism and compromise and deeply critical of the federal government's perceived hesitancy. On the other side, you had more moderate figures, particularly within the leadership of the NAACP, like Roy Wilkins, and the National Urban League, like Whitney Young, as well as some older clergy and labor leaders. They tended to emphasize legislative action, working within the system, building alliances, and maintaining a relationship with the federal government, even if it required compromise. They feared that overly radical rhetoric or actions might alienate essential political allies like President Kennedy or moderate members of Congress, potentially jeopardizing the passage of critical legislation like the Civil Rights Bill.
And Dr. King, where did he fit in that spectrum?
Dr. King occupied a unique position, often bridging the gap. He was deeply committed to nonviolence and direct action, like SNCC, but he was also a masterful strategist who understood the need for political alliances and broader public support. He could deliver incredibly powerful, morally charged rhetoric like his "I Have a Dream" speech that day, while also engaging in high-level negotiations. He was respected by both factions, which is why his appeal to Lewis to modify the speech carried so much weight. This negotiation, this balancing act between different approaches, was a key, often overlooked, aspect of the march's planning and its ultimate success.
It really was a delicate balance, wasn't it? Trying to present this powerful, unified message to the nation and the world while simultaneously grappling with these very real ideological and strategic differences within the movement itself. The author's analysis of the march's impact, and importantly, the compromises behind it, offers a truly nuanced view of activism. It wasn't this perfectly harmonious event, not a seamless coming together of one mind, but it was still incredibly powerful.
Oh, incredibly powerful. And that nuance is important. It showed that even with internal disagreements, even with painful compromises, a shared vision and strategic cooperation could lead to monumental collective action. The march profoundly amplified the movement's message, both domestically and internationally. The sheer number of people peacefully assembled was a powerful statement in itself. The peaceful conduct of the crowd, despite the massive numbers and the tense national climate, defied the fears and predictions of chaos that some had voiced. And of course, the soaring oratory, particularly King's "I Have a Dream" speech, broadcast globally, sent this unmistakable message about the moral urgency and the righteous demand for justice in America.
It became an iconic moment instantly.
Instantly, it was a masterclass in moral persuasion on a global stage. It put immense pressure on Congress and the Kennedy administration to act decisively on civil rights legislation. It shifted public opinion, making support for civil rights more mainstream.
And even though Lewis's speech was toned down, did it still resonate? Did his core message still break through?
I think it did, yes. While he had to remove some of his most potent criticisms and the Sherman reference, the core of his message, the urgency, the demand for freedom now, the impatience with tokenism, the connection between jobs and freedom, the call for immediate and fundamental change, the defiance against injustice still came through powerfully. He still asked pointed questions like, how long can we be patient? He still talked about the suffering in the South. It captured the impatient spirit of the young activists who felt the struggle most acutely. It resonated with a generation that was tired of waiting. Even in its modified form, it was a speech that signaled the rising power and the distinct voice of SNCC within the broader movement.
So what of the march? What was its immediate legislative or public opinion impact? Did it achieve its goals?
Well, it wasn't just a powerful symbolic event, though it was certainly that. It was a critical catalyst for legislative action. It demonstrated the undeniable political power of mass nonviolent protest in a way that policymakers simply could not ignore any longer. It significantly boosted momentum for the Civil Rights Act, which Kennedy had proposed but was facing significant opposition in Congress. While Kennedy would tragically be assassinated just a few months later, the moral force generated by the march helped President Lyndon B. Johnson push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress the following year. It also laid crucial groundwork for the voting rights campaign that would follow, culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So yes, its impact was tangible and profound, directly paving the way for landmark legislation.
A truly monumental moment, born from incredible effort, negotiation, and conviction. We're covering a lot of ground today. If this deep dive into March Book 2 is resonating with you, please consider hitting like, subscribe, and share. It truly helps support the show. So what does this all mean for the aftermath of the March on Washington? Chapter 5, the final chapter of Book 2, really helps us reflect on that. It shows how the movement gained significant momentum from the march, but almost immediately faced new, daunting, and tragic challenges. It reminded everyone in the most brutal way that the fight was far, far from over. The authors delve into what these new challenges were, specifically mentioning ongoing voter suppression and internal divisions.
Yes, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Lewis and Aydin provide some incredibly insightful analysis of the movement's evolution here. They show how a moment of incredible hope and national unity, like the March, could be immediately followed by an act of unspeakable terror, forcing a reckoning. One of the most heartbreaking events that occurred just weeks after the March on Washington, underscoring the ongoing, vicious violence the movement faced, was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. This happened on Sunday, September 15th, 1963.
Just 18 days after the March. Unbelievable.
18 days. 4 young black girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley were killed. They were in the church basement preparing for Youth Day services when a bomb planted by members of the Ku Klux Klan exploded. The church had been a frequent meeting place for civil rights activities, making it a deliberate target.
It's just sickening after such a hopeful moment.
Exactly. This horrific act of domestic terrorism sent shockwaves of grief and outrage through the nation and the world. Lewis describes the profound shock, the renewed grief, the anger this brought to the movement. It starkly reminded everyone that progress was incredibly fragile and that extreme violence would continue to be a tool used by white supremacists to resist change, even after a powerful display of unity like the March on Washington. It hardened the resolve of many activists, but also, arguably, deepened some of the strategic divisions about how best to respond to such brutality. It solidified the movement's focus on fundamental change, particularly in the most resistant areas like Alabama and Mississippi.
It truly was a gut-wrenching moment, powerfully depicted in the book. And as a result, partly because events like the bombing and the continued fierce resistance, the movement's focus decisively shifted toward voting rights, didn't it? While the monumental Civil Rights Act of 1964, which the March helped propel forward, would address public accommodations and employment discrimination, the bombing and the ongoing struggles underscored that fundamental lasting change really required political power.
Precisely. Lewis and Aydin highlight how the failures in achieving consistent desegregation on the ground, the persistence of violence, and the deep entrenchment of segregationist politicians made securing the right to vote seem like the next crucial, perhaps most crucial, frontier. The logic was simple, yet profound. If black citizens in the South could register and vote freely, without intimidation or discriminatory barriers like poll taxes and literacy tests, they could elect representatives who would actually represent their interests. They could dismantle segregation through local and state legislation, hold law enforcement accountable, and truly address economic inequality through political channels.
Power at the ballot box.
Exactly, power at the ballot box. This realization really set the stage for the major campaigns that would define the next phase of the movement, which March. Book 3 goes on to cover. We see this focus emerge with Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964. Hundreds of mostly white college student volunteers joined black activists from SNCC and CORE to register black voters, facing immense violence, intimidation, and tragically the murder of 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Then, of course, came the iconic Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, directly confronting voter suppression in Alabama. This led to the infamous Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis himself, leading the march, was brutally beaten by state troopers, suffering a fractured skull.
An image seared into history.
Absolutely. These campaigns, Freedom Summer and Selma, were a direct response to the understanding that without political power, without the fundamental right to vote being secured and protected, other hard-won gains would always be limited and fragile.
And what's particularly poignant in this final chapter of Book 2 is how the authors connect these intense past struggles to more contemporary moments. They use the framework of John Lewis being present at Barack Obama's 2009 inauguration to reflect on this period. Can you elaborate on the significance of that framing device? It's quite powerful.
It's incredibly powerful. The book brilliantly blends hope with the sobering reality of continued injustice by using this framing device throughout the March trilogy, but particularly effectively here at the end of Book 2. You see these moments of profound hope encapsulated by Lewis standing there on the National Mall again, but this time watching the inauguration of Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States. Here was John Lewis, a man who had, as we've discussed, literally fought, bled, nearly died for the right to vote, for racial equality, a man whose skull was fractured by state troopers on a bridge in Selma just for trying to march for that right, standing there as a witness to this monumental achievement. It signifies an incredible, almost unimaginable triumph for the ideals he and so many others fought for. It's a testament to the long, often agonizingly slow arc of justice, showing how far the nation had come. A truly full-circle moment for him. A deeply moving, full-circle moment. But the book, crucially, doesn't allow for simple, uncomplicated triumph. It juxtaposes these moments of progress with constant reminders of the struggle, the cost, and the work still left undone. It acknowledges the sobering reality, the ongoing fight against new forms of voter suppression, the continued racial divisions within society, the persistent economic inequalities, the echoes of injustice that still reverberate. The narrative and Powell's visuals capture this bittersweet tone perfectly. Often, a panel might show Lewis at the inauguration, looking reflective, perhaps followed immediately by a flashback to a violent confrontation from the 1960s or a reminder of the church bombing. It effectively connects past and present, reminding the reader of the immense cost of that journey to progress and implicitly how fragile that progress can be, how much vigilance is still required.
And this chapter, and really the whole book, truly does effectively bridge the 1960s to today's fight for equality, doesn't it? It makes you, the listener, consider the parallels, the continued struggles. Even today, we see ongoing, often intense debates about voting rights access, racial justice, police reform, systemic inequalities.
That's precisely why Lewis's story as told in March remains urgent. This isn't just a historical account to be filed away. It feels like a living guide, a handbook, almost, for persistent, principled activism. It reminds us forcefully of the power of nonviolent resistance, even in the face of state-sanctioned brutality. It reminds us of the immense personal sacrifices required to achieve social change, and it gives us that complex, nuanced view of social movements, the internal dynamics, the arguments, the compromises that are often obscured by simplified, heroic narratives.
It feels very relevant.
Extremely relevant. The enduring lessons for listeners today are about the vital importance of perseverance, especially when facing daunting opposition or setbacks. It teaches us that the fight for civil rights, for human rights, is a continuous, often generational effort. Progress is rarely linear. It often involves steps forward and steps back, born from immense struggle. Lewis's life demonstrates the need for unwavering courage, both physical and moral, and sometimes a willingness to make difficult strategic compromises for the greater good without sacrificing core principles. The urgency lies in recognizing that the fundamental principles and the core challenges of Lewis's time, securing the right to vote for all, ensuring equal access and opportunity, fighting against systemic injustice and ingrained prejudice, are still profoundly relevant to our efforts, your efforts, to achieve a more just and equitable society today. His narrative is ultimately a powerful, inspiring call to action, reminding us all that good trouble, necessary trouble, is sometimes still very necessary.
It's a living history, absolutely, demanding our continued attention and perhaps our own action in whatever form that takes. So, what does this all mean? Wow. Today, we've taken a really deep dive into March, Book 2. We've witnessed the incredible courage and strategic thinking of those young activists in the Nashville Sit-Ins. We've journeyed through the harrowing, terrifying experiences of the Freedom Riders as they pushed into the Deep South, facing down mobs and state power. And we've stood, metaphorically, at the March on Washington, understanding both its unifying power and its profound internal complexities. Throughout it all, we've seen how John Lewis's deeply personal narrative weaves through these pivotal moments, revealing the strategic brilliance, the immense personal cost, and the enduring, vital legacy of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how the story of March, Book 2, isn't just history that you read about and put back on the shelf. It feels like a living testament, especially that graphic novel format, to the transformative power of persistent, disciplined, nonviolent resistance. It reminds us that fundamental progress, real change, is almost always born from immense struggle. It often involves those hard-won compromises we talked about, and it always requires unwavering courage, especially when facing brutal, violent opposition. Lewis's journey, captured so powerfully by him, Andrew Aydin, and Nate Powell, compels us to confront that past, not as some distant, settled memory, but as a living echo that continues to shape our present and form our future.
That leads us to a final, provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider as you reflect on everything we've discussed today. Knowing the deeply personal, physical, and emotional sacrifices made by individuals like John Lewis and so many others described in this book, how might their steadfast commitment to nonviolence, even in the face of the most horrific brutality imaginable, inspire or perhaps challenge your own approach to advocating for change in the world around you today? What does their example mean for how we confront injustice now? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into March, Book 2. It's been a powerful journey. If you've enjoyed this exploration or found it valuable, please do remember to like, subscribe, and share. It genuinely helps us bring more deep dives like this to curious minds like yours. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.